The scent of ginger and roasted chili cut through the familiar dusty air of Prosperity, Nevada, a welcome novelty against the usual smells of horse, leather, and stale beer. Arthur Vance, a man whose life had become as plain and predictable as the vast rangeland he worked, followed the aroma to its source. There, under the shade of the assayer's office awning, two young women stood behind a simple plank table laden with small, intricately folded parcels of dough and steaming pots of food. They were identical, so perfectly mirrored that for a moment Arthur thought the summer heat was playing tricks on his eyes. One wore a dress the pale blue of a morning sky, the other a soft green like new spring leaves. They were slight, with dark, intelligent eyes that scanned the bustling street with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They couldn't have been more than 18. Chinese girls. A rare sight in this part of the territory, and certainly a rarer one to be running a business, however small, on their own. Arthur was a man of routine. He brought his cattle to market twice a year, sold them for a fair price, bought the supplies he needed to last him 6 months, and returned to the profound silence of his ranch. His wife, Martha, had been gone for 5 years, and the silence had grown teeth. He was lonely, though he'd never say the word aloud. He was just settled into a quiet life that was beginning to feel more like a slow burial. Today, with coin heavy in his pocket and another long, quiet season stretching before him, the scent of their cooking felt like a rebellion against that silence. He approached the table, his shadow falling over their wares. The girl in blue looked up, her expression guarded. The one in green offered a small, hesitant smile. "Good morning," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to a small bowl filled with what looked like pieces of chicken swimming in a fiery red, oil-slicked sauce, dotted with dark, wrinkled peppercorns. "What's this here?" The girl in green, Jing, spoke first. Her English was careful, each word chosen like a precious stone. "Is chicken. From our home." "Smells good," Arthur said, reaching into his pocket for a coin. "I'll take a bowl." Suddenly, both sisters stiffened. The girl in blue, An, stepped forward, her hands fluttering in a gesture of negation. "Oh, no, sir, please, not that one." Jing nodded in fervent agreement, her eyes wide. "Is not for you. Too much fire." She fanned her mouth with her hand to illustrate. Arthur chuckled. He was a man who'd faced blizzards, droughts, and cattle rustlers. He figured he could handle a little spice. "Ma'am, I've eaten camp chili that could strip paint. I'm sure I'll be fine." He placed a silver dollar on the table, a generous price for a simple street meal. He saw their eyes flicker towards the coin, saw the conflict there. They needed the money, that much was clear. But their warning was genuine, their concern almost frantic. "Please, don't eat it," Anne whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of a passing freight wagon. Her plea only strengthened Arthur's resolve. He saw it as a challenge, a small, harmless adventure in an otherwise colorless day. He picked up the bowl and a wooden fork they offered. "I appreciate the warning, ladies." He took one bite. The first sensation was not heat, but an explosion of flavor. Savory, deep, complex. Then the fire came, a clean, sharp heat that was unlike any chili he'd ever tasted. It was invigorating. He grinned, ready to tell them they'd underestimated him. But then a third sensation rolled in, something utterly alien. It was a tingling, numbing wave that started on his tongue and spread, a pins and needles feeling that seemed to vibrate through his jaw. His throat seized. His breath hitched. The muscles in his face went slack, and he found he could not move his mouth to speak. His eyes watered, and the world seemed to tilt slightly. He froze, fork halfway to his mouth for a second bite, his entire body locked in a state of stunned paralysis. He was not in pain. He was simply offline. A puppet with its strings cut. Through a shimmering haze of tears, he saw the sisters' faces contort with panic. They started speaking to him in rapid, urgent Chinese, their hands gesturing wildly, but their voices were drowned out by a new one, a loud, pompous boom that came from his right. "What's this, then?" Bartholomew Sterling, the owner of the town's largest freight company, strode towards the scene. He was a big man who used his size to intimidate and his wealth to bully. He had a particular dislike for any enterprise that wasn't his own, especially one run by foreigners. "Vance? What's wrong with you, man?" Arthur tried to answer, to wave a hand, to signal that he was all right, just temporarily incapacitated by a peppercorn. But his body would not obey. He could only stand there, a statue of a man holding a bowl of chicken. Sterling's eyes narrowed, shifting from Arthur's frozen face to the terrified sisters. A cruel, opportunistic smile spread across his fleshy features. He pointed a thick finger at the girls. "Poison!" Sterling bellowed, the word cracking like a whip. "These heathens have poisoned Arthur Vance, right here in the street!" The word spread through the crowd like a prairie fire. People stopped, turned, and stared. The hum of commerce died, replaced by a low, angry murmur. Men started to move from the saloon and the general store, their expressions hardening. "They tried to warn me," Arthur thought, a desperate, silent scream in his mind. "It's not poison. It's just fire." But he couldn't speak. He could only watch as the crowd, stoked by Sterling's accusations, began to close in on the two terrified young women, their faces pale, their backs pressed against the rough brick wall of the assayer's office. The blue and green of their dresses looked fragile and small against the tide of dark, dusty denim and righteous anger surging towards them. And he, the man who had caused it all, was powerless to stop it. The tingling in Arthur's jaw began to subside, replaced by a rush of adrenaline. He could feel his fingers again, could flex them around the wooden bowl. The crowd was a wall of grim faces now, Sterling at its head, playing the part of their righteous leader. "Sheriff's coming," someone yelled. "Hold 'em there!" Anne and Jing huddled together, a single trembling entity in two different colors. Jing had her arm around Anne's shoulder, trying to shield her, though there was nowhere to hide. Arthur could see the raw fear in their eyes, the fear of people who knew what a mob could do, who had no one to stand for them. Something inside Arthur, something that had been dormant for 5 long years, broke loose. It was the part of him that had protected Martha, the part that had built a ranch from nothing, the part that knew right from wrong as clearly as he knew the North Star. He managed a deep, rasping breath. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. He forced a word out, a croak that was barely human. "Stop." No one heard him. Sterling was busy whipping the crowd into a frenzy. "We don't need this kind here, coming in, selling their strange food, poisoning good men." Arthur took another breath, this one deeper. He dropped the bowl of chicken, the clang of it hitting the dirt, drawing a few eyes. He straightened up, his 6-foot frame a solid, immovable presence. "I said, stop," he said. This time, the voice was his own. It was rough, but it was loud enough to cut through the din. The crowd quieted. Heads turned. Sterling looked over, his face falling in surprise and disappointment. "Vance, you're all right?" "No thanks to you," Arthur rasped, taking a step forward to place himself between the mob and the two sisters. He could feel their small bodies trembling behind him. "You were about to do something you'd regret, Sterling. All of you." "But they poisoned you," a man shouted from the back. Arthur shook his head, wiping the lingering tears from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "It's not poison. It's pepper. A kind I've never had before. A strong kind." He looked at An and Jing over his shoulder. "They tried to warn me, told me not to eat it. I was too proud to listen." He turned his gaze back to Sterling, his eyes cold. "You saw a man have a reaction to some spicy food, and you tried to turn it into a lynching. For what? Because they're selling food on your street?" Sterling puffed out his chest. "They don't belong here." "I reckon they belong here as much as you do," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "They're trying to make an honest living, which is more than can be said for some." The crowd began to look uneasy, shifting on their feet. They knew Arthur Vance. He was a quiet man, but a fair one. His word carried weight. They also knew Bartholomew Sterling, and they knew his greed. The certainty of the mob began to fracture, replaced by individual doubt. Sheriff Brody arrived then, a tired-looking man with a drooping mustache. "What's the commotion, Sterling? Arthur, you look a fright." "Sterling was about to start a riot over a bowl of spicy chicken, Sheriff," Arthur said plainly. Sterling sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "It was a clear case of public endangerment." "The only thing endangered here," Arthur said, his voice dropping low, "was two young women who did nothing wrong." He didn't move from his protective stance. He could feel the warmth of the sisters behind him, the slight pressure of a hand on his back. He didn't know if it was Anne or Jing, but it sent a strange current through him. Sheriff Brody sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at the sisters, then at Sterling, then at Arthur. "All right, that's enough. Everyone break it up. Go on about your business." He leveled a stern look at Sterling. "And you, go cool your head before you say something that gets you in real trouble." Sterling, robbed of his audience and his cause, shot a venomous glare at Arthur and the sisters before turning on his heel and stomping away. The crowd dissolved, muttering amongst themselves, leaving Arthur, the sheriff, and the two women alone in the sudden quiet. "You sure you're all right, Arthur?" the sheriff asked. "I'll live," Arthur said. He turned to the sisters. Their table was a mess, some of their goods knocked to the ground in the commotion. Their faces were still pale with shock, but the terror in their eyes had been replaced with something else. Gratitude. "Thank you," the girl in blue, Anne, said softly. "You saved us," Jing added, her voice trembling slightly. Arthur just nodded, feeling awkward. He looked at their scattered belongings, at the fear that still clung to them like dust. He knew Sterling. The man held a grudge. He wouldn't let this go. The sisters wouldn't be safe here in town. An idea, sudden and reckless, took root in his mind. It was the most impulsive thing he'd done in years. "You can't stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Pack up your things. You're coming with me." The sisters exchanged a wide-eyed look. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Arthur, what are you planning?" "I'm planning on seeing these ladies are safe," Arthur said, already gathering their pots. "Sterling won't bother them out at my place. They can stay at the ranch until this blows over." It was a crazy notion. Taking in two strangers, two young women, the town would talk. But as he looked at their faces, at the resilience and dignity that shone through their fear, he knew he couldn't just walk away and leave them to fend for themselves. For the first time in a long time, the silence of his ranch seemed like a problem he could solve. The wagon ride to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet from the one Arthur was used to. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of the morning's events. Anne and Jing sat on the buckboard beside him, their hands folded in their laps, their colorful dresses a stark contrast to the dusty, sun-bleached landscape. They looked small against the vastness of the territory. Arthur's ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of cottonwoods that grew along a seasonal creek. The house was solid, built of thick timber he'd hauled himself, with a wide porch and two stone chimneys. It was a good house, a strong house, but it was an empty house. As they pulled up, Arthur saw it through their eyes. The neat but empty corrals, the well-swept but silent porch, the windows like vacant eyes staring out at the range. It wasn't a home, it was a shelter. He helped them down from the wagon, his large, calloused hands gentle on their arms. "Here we are," he said, the words sounding hollow in the stillness. "It's not much, but it's safe." He led them inside. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, a long dining table Martha had insisted on, and 4 chairs. Everything was clean, tidy, and utterly devoid of life. The air was stale with disuse. Anne and Jean stood just inside the doorway, taking it all in. Arthur suddenly felt a pang of shame. He hadn't realized just how empty his life had become until he saw it reflected in their hesitant expressions. "The kitchen is through there," he said, gesturing. "There are 2 spare rooms upstairs. You can take your pick." They bowed their heads slightly. "You are too kind, Mr. Vance," Jean said. "It's Arthur," he corrected, "and it's the least I could do after the trouble I caused you." That night a transformation began. While Arthur saw to the horses, the sisters, without a word, entered the kitchen. When he came back inside, the scent of garlic and simmering broth was already beginning to chase the stale air from the house. He found them moving around his kitchen in a silent, seamless dance. Anne was chopping vegetables with a speed and precision that mesmerized him. Jing was tending a pot on the stove, her movements fluid and sure. They had found their language. They served him a simple meal of noodle soup, but it was the most flavorful thing he had ever tasted. It was warm and restorative, and it filled the room with a life that had been absent for years. As they ate, they began to talk. They told him their story, speaking in turns, sometimes finishing each other's sentences. They were from a province called Sichuan. Their parents had sent them to America with their uncle, who was supposed to help them get established before the rest of the family followed. But the uncle had taken their money and abandoned them in Sacramento. They had made their way to Nevada, following the railroad, working odd jobs and cooking to survive. Their dream was to earn enough to buy a small plot of land to make a home for their parents when they arrived. The dish he had eaten, they explained, was a specialty from their home. It was made with hua jiao, a type of peppercorn that produced the numbing sensation he'd experienced. It was a taste they recreated for themselves, a fierce, defiant reminder of who they were and where they came from. It was their comfort, their secret taste of home, never intended for the uninitiated palate of a lone rancher. Arthur listened, his heart aching for their hardship, and his admiration for their strength growing with every word. He, in turn, told them about Martha, about the ranch they had built together, and about the silence she had left behind. He spoke of his loneliness not as a feeling, but as a physical presence, a cold spot in the center of his house. In the warm, lamp-lit kitchen, surrounded by the aroma of their cooking, the 3 of them were no longer just a rancher and 2 refugees. They were 3 lonely people finding a flicker of connection in an empty house. A few days later, a rider came from town. It was a man who worked for Sterling, and he carried not a threat of violence, but something far more insidious. It was a notice from the territorial clerk, a formal inquiry into the legal status of 2 unchaperoned Chinese women residing outside of the designated districts. It was a bureaucratic weapon, sharp and cold, designed to entangle them in a system that was built to exclude them. Arthur read the document, his jaw tight with anger. Sterling was trying to use the law to do what his mob could not. He could have them deported, or at the very least, forced into a holding facility in a larger city. He looked at An and Jing, who were watching him, their faces tense with worry. He saw the life that had just begun to bloom in his house, the warmth, the sounds, the smells. He saw their dream of a home for their family. and he saw Sterling trying to crush it all under the heel of his boot. He knew then that letting them stay until this blows over wasn't enough. A temporary solution was no solution at all. They needed a permanent one. They needed protection that no territorial clerk or freight baron could challenge. They needed a name. His name. That evening he sat them down at the long dining table. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he laid them on the wood. "Sterling won't stop," he said quietly. "This paper is just the beginning. He will try to have you removed." Anne's hand went to Jing's, their fingers lacing together. "What can we do?" Jing asked. Arthur took a deep breath. The words felt heavy, momentous. "There is a way to give you protection, a way to make this your home, legally, for good." He looked from one face to the other, seeing the same question in their identical dark eyes. "I need help on this ranch," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm not getting any younger, and this house needs a family in it. I need a wife." He saw them flinch slightly, a flicker of disappointment crossing their features. He hurried to continue. "But I see you two. I've watched you. You are not two separate people. You are one heart in two bodies. I could not ask one of you to stay and the other to go. I will not be the one to break you apart." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the room. "I will marry one of you, on paper, to give you both my name, my protection. But in my heart, in this house, you will both be my wives. This will be our family, the three of us, together, if you'll have me." The silence that followed was absolute, and Jing stared at him, their expressions unreadable. He had offered them the only thing he had of value, his name, his home, his life. It was a strange, radical proposal, a bargain struck from desperation and a deep, growing affection. He had laid his heart bare, and now he could only wait for their answer, the fate of the silence resting in their hands. Anne and Jing turned to each other, a silent conversation passing between them in a language of raised eyebrows, slight nods, and glances Arthur could not interpret. They spoke to each other in low, rapid Sichuanese, their words a soft, flowing river in the quiet room. Arthur sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the table, feeling more vulnerable than he had when facing Sterling's mob. He had offered them a partnership, a strange, unconventional family, forged in the face of hardship. It was a proposal that defied every convention of the society they lived in, but it was honest. Finally, they turned back to him. It was Anne who spoke, her voice clear and steady. "In our country, a man might have more than one wife. It is not so strange to us. What is strange is a man who offers his name to protect two strangers." Jing continued, her gaze direct. "You did not see us as a prize or a burden. You saw us as one. You wished to protect our bond. That is a greater kindness than you know." An took a breath. "We accept, Arthur. We will be your family." A feeling washed over Arthur then, a profound sense of rightness that settled deep in his bones. The cold spot in the center of his house seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. They were married the following week. Arthur and An stood before the circuit judge in Prosperity, with Jing as their witness. Sterling was in attendance, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief. The law now saw An Vance as the rancher's wife, and Jing as her sister living under his roof. It was a legal shield, solid and irrefutable. Sterling had lost. The town whispered, of course, but the whispers were of a lonely rancher who'd done a noble thing for two helpless immigrants. Few guessed the true nature of their arrangement. 6 months later, the Vance Ranch was a different world. A sprawling vegetable garden flourished where there had once been only packed dirt. Chickens scratched in a newly built coop, and the scent of baking bread often drifted from the kitchen door. The house was filled with the sound of chatter and laughter. Their food stall in town had become a permanent fixture, a small eatery with 2 tables known as the Twin Sisters' Kitchen. It was wildly popular. Miners, cowboys, and townsfolk alike lined up for their spicy noodles, savory dumplings, and fragrant soups. Jing's quiet efficiency managed the customers, while Anne's culinary artistry commanded the kitchen. Their success was a constant public rebuke to Bartholomew Sterling, whose own preferred grub house saw less and less business. Their life together settled into a gentle rhythm. Arthur would rise before dawn to work the ranch, his body strong and his purpose clear. He would come home at midday to a hot meal, and the 3 of them would eat together, sharing stories of their morning. Anne was the fiery, creative one, always experimenting with new recipes. Jing was the calm, steady one, who managed their finances with a sharp mind and brought a sense of order to their lives. They were a unit, a 3-stranded cord that could not be easily broken. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, Arthur cleaning a piece of tack, Anne and Jing mending clothes or talking quietly. Sometimes he would tell them stories of the stars, constellations Martha had taught him. They, in turn, would tell him folk tales from their homeland. One cool autumn evening, Anne brought out a bowl of the very chicken that had started it all. She placed it in front of Arthur, a playful glint in her eye. Jing stood behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you brave enough tonight, husband?" Anne teased. Arthur grinned. He took a bite, bracing himself. The familiar, explosive combination of flavor, fire, and the tingling numbness washed over him. This time, however, it was not a shock. It was a welcome, a reminder. He let out a long, happy sigh, his eyes watering slightly. "It's good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It tastes like home." Jing's hand squeezed his shoulder gently. Anne reached across the table and covered his free hand with her own. He looked at their faces, so perfectly identical, yet so uniquely precious to him, illuminated in the soft glow of the lantern. He saw his past, his present, and his future all there in their loving eyes. The world outside might see a strange and questionable arrangement, but here, on this porch, under the vast, starry canvas of the Nevada sky, they were simply a family. A family born from a single, fiery bite of chicken, a moment of foolish pride, and an act of unexpected courage. Arthur Vance had sought a cure for his silence, and in a way he never could have imagined, he had found a symphony. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.